Solvete omnes, and welcome to the first and second conjugation review. So first, we're going to cover the present indicative for the active and passive. So the first conjugation, notice how you have an O to an AS to an AT, AMUS, ATIS, ANT. Notice those personal indicators for the active tense, OST, MUS, TIS, NT. Then when you switch over to the passive, notice how the vowel stays the same, but the endings change, and you see your passive endings, r, ris, ter, mer, mini, and entor. Second conjugation is very similar, except where you have the A, you have an E, and notice how you have the E even in the first singular. When you move on to the passive, again, vowels stay the same, but the endings change, your passive endings, r, ris, ter, mer, mini, and entor. Moving on to the imperfect. So the imperfect is the sheep tense, the ba with the ba. In the first conjugation present active, you notice you have an a between the stem and the bomb. So bomb. And again, instead of having the o for the first singular, you have an m, but it's mst, mus, tis, nt. The passive will follow the same pattern again that we saw in the present. You have the personal indicators, just the vowels stay the same and the endings change. So M goes to R, S goes to ris. Second conjugation, very similar to the first, except when you have an E before the bomb instead of an A. Notice when you go from active to passive, the only difference is changing the endings. Moving on to the future. So the first and second conjugation uses the bo, bis, bit, bimus, bitus, bunt. Notice how it goes to O to I and then bunt at the end. The stem vowel before the bo is the same that you saw in the imperfect. Then when you go into the passive, you change the endings. Notice here in the second singular, the Romans did not like the IRIS, and most of the time they would change that to an ERIS. And then future video will show you the exception, but most times if you see an IRIS, you're going to switch that to an E when you're dealing with verbs. And again, exactly the same set of endings. The only difference between the first and the second is you have an E before the bo, bis, bit instead of an A. So the perfect. So the perfect system will deal with the third principal part. Up until now, the present, the imperfect, and the future all stem from the first. We deal with the perfect system. We're going to deal with the third principal part for the active and the fourth principal part for the passive. And the perfect is the same for all verbs. You take the third principal part, and it's amawi, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt. To make this passive, you take the fourth principal part, and if I was going to write this all the way out, it'd be amatus, aum. That fourth principal part, or the participle, agrees with the subject of the sentence in gender and number. I just made it masculine for demonstration purposes. But if this was feminine, I'd have an A there. So amatus sum, amatus est, amatus est, amati sumus, amati estis, amati sunt. And when we move to the second conjugation, you notice the pattern is exactly the same. The perfect, active, and passive is the same for all conjugations. It follows the same exact pattern coming from the third and the fourth principal part. The past perfect, again, for the active, you use that third principal part. Key thing to note is you drop the I there, so it's a maweram. And the eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. This comes from the imperfect of sum. So the imperfect of sum is used for the past perfect endings. And again, for the passive, we use the fourth principal part, amatus, eram, eras, erat. Notice that it goes to amati in the plural, and I'm using this as a masculine example. If this was feminine, it'd be A and AE. If it was neuter, it'd be and A. And again, second conjugation is exactly the same. There's no differences. Use the third principal part for the active and the fourth principal part for the passive. And then the future perfect. So you have ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, eritus, erint. This comes from the future of sum. Notice at the end, instead of erunt, it is erint. This is changed so you can differentiate between the future perfect and the simple perfect. Notice there's no I. The I drops off the third principal part. Same pattern you see with the future perfect passive. You take the fourth principal part and use ero, eris, eret, erimus, eritis, erunt. Notice it goes back to the erunt because in the perfect passive, it's sunt. So there's no discrepancy, no need to change vowels. And again, with the second conjugation, is exactly the same. Again, notice the third person plural, erint in the active, erunt in the passive. Moving on to the subjunctive. And so remember the phrase, let's beat a giant. And so let's would be for the first conjugation. And so our subjunctive ending, it would be an E. And again, the endings are the same. Notice I put an M right here because it goes to an M in the subjunctive for the first singular. And then to make it passive, again, just changing my endings to R, ris, ter, mer, mini, and entor. So for the second conjugation, it's let's beat, EA. So my stem vowel for the present subjunctive is EA for the second conjugation. So I have the EA all the way down. And when I want to make it passive, just change the ending. R, ris, ter, mer, mini, and entor. So the imperfect subjunctive. So the imperfect subjunctive is you take the second principal part, which is the infinitive, and so you take the present active infinitive. And when we talk about deponents, it's a little different, but because you'll actually use what the present active would be, not the second principal part. But for this case, you just take the second principal part, which is the present active infinitive, and you plug on your endings, both for the active and the passive. And the second conjugation is exactly the same. You take that second principal part, the present active infinitive, and you plug on your endings. Active endings for the imperfect subjunctive active, passive endings for the imperfect subjunctive passive. Moving on to the perfect subjunctive, you take the third principal part and you put erim, eris, eret, erimus, eritis, erint. It looks very much like the future perfect active for the indicative. The only difference is instead of ero, you have erim. When you form the first, for the first conjugation, perfect passive subjunctive, it's similar to the indicative, except instead of using sum, use the subjunctive of sum. So the present subjunctive of sum is sum, sis, sit, simu, sitis, sint. And then for the second conjugation is exactly the same. Because remember, the perfect system, which encompasses the perfect, the past perfect, and the future perfect, is the same for all conjugations. That's what's really nice about the perfect. And lastly, the past perfect, subjunctive, active, and passive. This is the perfect active infinitive, amawisi. And again, I just add on my endings. And when I make it passive, I'll use the imperfect subjunctive of sum, amawisam, amawises, amawiset, as I go all the way down through. I just noticed here I need to make this plural. So notice that typo here, that they should be amati. And again, with the perfect system, it is exactly the same, for first and second conjugation. And here I actually did catch the typo and made these plural. There isn't subjunctive for the future or the future perfect. So hope you enjoyed that and found that helpful. Well, late discipuli.